Can someone please explain to me why the largest nuclear threat to America isn't on every news channel? The issue is clear and has been well documented for 50 years. The contamination is only getting worse. The cleanup is taking a back seat to other issues. But this issue threatens all of us. There is a place in America sitting right now on the banks of one of the most important rivers in the western United States, and it contains the single most radioactively contaminated piece of land in the entire Western Hemisphere. It's not in some remote wasteland. It's not buried under an ocean. It's 7 miles from the Columbia River, the river that supplies drinking water to millions of people, that runs through prime farmland and fisheries across Washington and Oregon, that flows all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's called Hanford. And it is a nuclear crisis that has been building for 80 years. Today we're going to talk about what Hanford is, how it got so bad, why the cleanup has been delayed for decades, and what scientists and government auditors say happens if nothing changes. Because this story deserves more attention than it gets, and the people living downriver deserve better than what they've been given. Section 1, The Origin Story. To understand Hanford, you have to go back to 1943. World War II is raging. The United States has just launched the Manhattan Project, the secret program to build the world's first nuclear weapon. And the government needs plutonium. A lot of it. They chose a stretch of desert in southeastern Washington state. They relocated thousands of farmers and Native American communities, including the Wanapum people, whose name literally means river people, and who had fished the Columbia for thousands of years. Their sacred fishing grounds were condemned. Their way of life was erased. No real negotiation. No real consent. Just federal orders and a war to win. Within 18 months, Hanford was operational. They built the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor, the B reactor, and within 2 years, Hanford produced plutonium that was in the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. By the peak of the Cold War, Hanford had 9 nuclear reactors and 5 massive chemical reprocessing plants, and it produced more than 67 tons of plutonium, roughly 2/3 of the entire United States nuclear stockpile. Here's the thing nobody talked about at the time: all of that production created waste. Enormous, staggering, incomprehensible amounts of waste. And in the rush of wartime production and Cold War urgency, the attitude toward that waste was essentially deal with it later. So they dumped it. Into trenches. Into the soil. Directly into the Columbia River, at documented rates of 7,000 to 20,000 curies of radioactivity per day through the 1950s. That radiation traveled downstream, into fish, into soil, into people. It reached the Pacific Ocean, 200 miles away. Later, they built 177 massive underground tanks to hold the worst of it. The problem? Those tanks were built fast and built cheap. And they were never meant to be a permanent solution. Section 2, The Scale of the Contamination. Here's where the numbers start to become almost incomprehensible. Hanford currently holds 56 million gallons of high-level radioactive and chemical waste, stored in those 177 aging underground tanks. The waste is a toxic cocktail: radioactive strontium, cesium, plutonium, uranium, technetium, iodine-129. Chemical solvents. Heavy metals. The kind of stuff that causes cancer, lodges in bones and organs, and in some cases has a half-life measured not in years or decades, but in thousands of centuries. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,100 years. At least 63 of those 177 tanks have leaked. An estimated 1 million gallons of radioactive liquid have already seeped into the soil, migrating downward through what's called the Vados zone, entering the groundwater, and moving steadily toward the Columbia River 7 miles away. Let that sink in. 1 million gallons of radioactive waste is already in the ground, moving toward a river that millions of people depend on. The 586 square mile site is a Superfund site, actually divided into 4 separate Superfund designations. There are more than 2,000 distinct waste sites on the property. Over 450 billion gallons of contaminated liquid was poured into the soil during Hanford's operating years. That's the equivalent of more than 680,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And in December 1949, classified for decades, Hanford scientists deliberately released between 259 and 444 trillion becquerels of radioactive iodine-131 into the atmosphere to test monitoring equipment. The amount of radiation released was 350 to 600 times greater than the total released during the 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown. It drifted over Oregon, Idaho, California, Montana, and into Canada. People living near Hanford didn't find out until 1986, when the Department of Energy released 19,000 pages of previously classified documents under pressure from activists using the Freedom of Information Act. Section 3, the human cost. The statistics only tell part of the story. The human reality is darker. According to MIT professor and nuclear historian Kate Brown, by 1958 death rates in the Hanford area had climbed to 4 times the rate for the rest of Washington state. People living downwind and downriver reported higher rates of thyroid cancer, thyroid disorders, and other illnesses. The Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction Project, run with the CDC, found that a child living near Hanford could have received a cumulative thyroid radiation dose equivalent to roughly 670 chest CT scans. And no comprehensive epidemiological study of the affected population was ever conducted. The Native American tribes most heavily impacted, the Wanapum, the Yakama, the Nez Perce, the Umatilla, the Spokane, and others, relied on the Columbia River and its salmon for cultural survival. They were not warned. They were not compensated. They were not prioritized. They continue to fight for accountability today. Workers at the site have also suffered. Since 1987, workers have reported being sickened by vapors rising from the underground tanks, experiencing nosebleeds, headaches, burning skin, difficulty breathing, dizziness, and in some cases long-term cognitive damage. In 2014 alone, more than 40 workers reported vapor exposure symptoms. At least one death has been linked to Hanford vapor exposure. Workers who spoke out were fired. In 2014, OSHA ordered the facility to rehire a contractor and pay $220,000 in back wages specifically for retaliating against a whistleblower. One former worker, Seth Ellingsworth, was a healthy athlete before he inhaled an unknown substance on the job. Afterward, he struggled to breathe. He described the safety program this way: the program is designed to make workers feel safe, not actually be safe. Section 4, the cleanup, or lack thereof. Plutonium production at Hanford ended in 1989. Cleanup began in earnest shortly after, with a legal agreement signed in 1989 between the Department of Energy, the EPA, and Washington State called the Tri-Party Agreement. The original goal: clean up Hanford in 30 years. That was 35 years ago. The cleanup is nowhere near done. Here's the timeline of failure. The original plan called for the underground tank waste to be converted into a stable glass form, a process called vitrification, by 2009. Construction of the vitrification plant started in 2002. The original budget was $4 billion. The plant didn't process its first batch of real nuclear waste until October 2025, 16 years late. And by that point, the cost had grown from $4 billion to more than $17 billion for just the first facility. The total cleanup cost has been estimated by the GAO at between $363 billion and $578 billion, and is expected to take another 60 to 75 years. The full Hanford site, all 586 square miles, is legally supposed to be cleaned up by 2091. As of today, the DOE has internally shifted its own target dates back to 2069 just for the tank waste portion. The complete cleanup is expected to take until at least the end of this century. The first vitrification plant, now operational, can only handle approximately 40 to 50% of the lower activity waste. A second plant is needed for the rest. And the most terrifying piece, the high-level waste facility, the building designed to handle the most radioactive material of all, had its construction halted in 2012 due to major technical problems, and has barely progressed since. As of now, there is no finalized plan for where the vitrified high-level waste will ultimately be stored. The proposed Yucca Mountain Repository in Nevada, the original plan, was cancelled. No alternative repository has been approved. That's the reality: we're converting the most dangerous radioactive waste in America into glass, with no confirmed place to permanently put it. Section 5, why nothing has been done. Hanford is a story about more than technical failure. It's a story about institutional dysfunction, contractor accountability, and political cowardice. First, the contractor problem. The Department of Energy doesn't directly manage the cleanup, it hires massive private contractors. Companies like Bechtel National have been paid tens of billions of dollars over decades. The GAO has repeatedly found that DOE's oversight of those contractors has been inadequate, that cost overruns and schedule delays were allowed to spiral without proper management accountability. The contractors, shielded by the structure of their agreements, face limited consequences for failure. Second, the funding problem. The Washington State Department of Ecology estimates that a fully compliant cleanup budget for 2026 would require $6.15 billion. Congress approved $3.2 billion, a record, but still roughly half of what is actually needed. And now, the Trump administration has proposed cutting Hanford's budget by $400 million in its FY 2027 request. That cut would delay deactivation of the Hanford 324 building, a building sitting less than 1,000 feet from the Columbia River, directly over a known leak of highly radioactive cesium and strontium. Third, the political problem. Hanford has repeatedly been caught in the crossfire of federal budget politics and regulatory battles. Project 2025, the conservative blueprint that has heavily influenced the current administration, explicitly identified Washington state's regulatory oversight as an obstacle to be circumvented. It proposed reclassifying highly radioactive waste as something less dangerous so cheaper disposal methods could be used. Environmental groups and Washington state officials pushed back hard. The battle is ongoing. Fourth, the accountability vacuum. Workers who raised safety alarms were fired. Scientists who documented contamination were sidelined. Classified documents were kept secret for decades. When the truth finally came out in 1986, there was public outrage, but no criminal accountability. No one was charged. No company was dissolved. The people who made the decisions that contaminated the land, the river, and the people living near it were never held responsible. Section 6. What the solutions are. The good news is that solutions exist. Vitrification, turning the waste into glass, is the gold standard, and the process has now finally begun for low-activity waste. If fully funded and fully executed, it remains the safest long-term path. Other approaches include grouting, encasing lower-activity waste in a concrete-like substance as a faster and cheaper alternative for some portions of the waste. Apatite injection, pumping a phosphate mineral into the aquifer to trap strontium-90 before it reaches the Columbia River, has been deployed with some success. Pump and treat systems are running continuously to intercept contaminated groundwater. But the most important solution is also the simplest and most politically difficult: sustained, adequate, uninterrupted federal funding. The GAO has found that every dollar cut from Hanford's cleanup budget today multiplies into higher costs tomorrow. Delay doesn't save money, it compounds the problem. Strengthening contractor accountability, moving the cesium and strontium capsules to dry storage before their underwater storage facility degrades, completing the high-level waste facility, and finally designating a permanent national repository for high-level nuclear waste are all essential steps. On that last point, America has been kicking the Yucca Mountain can down the road for 30 years. At some point, a decision has to be made. The waste doesn't wait. Section 7, the projection: what happens if nothing changes? The Government Accountability Office has been the most credible voice warning about what comes next. Their reports have been consistent and damning. According to a 2022 GAO report, DOE faces serious risks related to the availability of key treatment facilities, the ability to operate them at planned rates, and, critically, the future condition of the aging waste tanks. Those tanks were built in the 1940s and 50s. They are well beyond their designed lifespan. 3 are actively leaking right now. More are assumed to have leaked in the past. And as the GAO, Columbia Riverkeeper, and independent scientists have warned, if the tank waste retrieval and treatment doesn't keep pace, the radioactive and toxic contamination in those tanks could continue, and potentially worsen, in its migration through soil and groundwater toward the Columbia River. The Columbia Riverkeeper has identified a radioactive iodine-129 groundwater plume that already extends more than 20 square miles beneath the site. Strontium-90 is still seeping toward the river near the old N reactor area. The 324 building, the one the Trump administration wants to pause cleanup work on, sits directly over a cesium and strontium leak less than 1,000 feet from the Columbia. Monitoring wells are watching it. But watching is not stopping. If the tanks fail before the waste is retrieved, whether through corrosion, seismic activity, or structural collapse, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Columbia River is not just an ecological resource. It's a drinking water source. It supports massive agricultural irrigation. It is the lifeblood of Pacific salmon runs that indigenous communities and commercial fisheries depend on. And some of this contamination is functionally permanent on any human timescale. Iodine-129 has a half-life of 15.7 million years. Plutonium-239, 24,100 years. Technetium-99, 211,000 years. Even if every tank were perfectly cleaned up tomorrow, the contamination already in the soil and groundwater would be a concern for generations upon generations. As Hanford Challenge, a worker advocacy organization, has put it, Hanford was called an underground Chernobyl waiting to happen when cleanup began. It still carries that risk today. Here is what we know: Hanford is the most contaminated nuclear site in the Western Hemisphere. The cleanup is underfunded, behind schedule, and now facing proposed budget cuts. The tanks are leaking. The groundwater is moving. And the river, the Columbia River, is 7 miles away. We know what the solutions are. We know what adequate funding looks like. We know what accountability looks like. What we've lacked for 80 years is the political will to demand it. The native communities whose land was taken deserve better. The workers who were sickened and silenced deserve better. The 2 million people who live along the Columbia River deserve better. And frankly, any American who pays taxes, because this cleanup is going to cost somewhere between $363 billion and $578 billion, deserves to know what their money is supposed to be going toward, and why it keeps falling short. So explain to me why more isn't being done? Why are we not up in arms about this issue? If this video gave you something to think about, share it. Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you have personal experience with Hanford or the Columbia River. And subscribe if you want more investigative reporting on environmental stories that don't always get the attention they deserve. The waste is real. The risk is real. And the clock is running.